Great. So good evening, everyone. I'd be very grateful if you could mute yourselves while I'm having my discussion with Klina. And I am Indra Adnan, and I'm the co-initiator of the Alternative UK, which is, for many of you, I hear it's the first time that you've been here, so you may not know that we're a political platform that exists to ask and answer the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And also on this call with me is Maria Dorthia-Skoff, who's our community manager and project manager. Wave, Maria, nice to see you. And before I move into our conversation with Klina Jordan tonight, I want to give a brief overview of what we can expect this evening. So this is neither a webinar, nor is it a workshop, but it's something in between. It's an extended conversation. And I'm going to chat with Klina for about 20-25 minutes. And then you'll have a chance to ask any immediate questions whatever comes up for you, or to be able to ask more details about what Klina introduced. And then we're going to go into breakout rooms so that you can take the discussion a little bit deeper through talking and listening with each other. And then after you've done that, we're going to come back in for another chance to share your ideas with Klina, so that we can, in a sense, try and break some new ground on the big issues that Klina is bringing. And a couple of words about the elephant. Over the past 3 years, the alternative has been asking this question: if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And one thing that's become clear to us is that the current politics is part of, or in service to, a socio-economic system that is busy destroying our planet. We won't be able to deliver a new politics until we've had a good sense of the new system that this new politics could be part of. And the elephant is the project that tries to name that new system, the thing we know is there, but we don't know quite yet how to talk about. And last December, we gathered 30 people together who we felt have been busy creating that new system, but have not yet come together as a fully working system that other people can buy into. So like the blind man and the elephant, each one can see a part of it, but none of them can quite see the whole thing. So each episode of this elephant series invites another one of these partially blind men or women to come and show us their perspective on this new system, in the hope that eventually over this series, we'll all be able to see more clearly the elephant in the room. So now over to Klina Jordan, who's the co-founder of Make Votes Matter, who's been a colleague of mine for most of my political life, and one of the people I've admired most for her courage, persistence, and ingenuity, in a sense, in trying to, well, I was going to say break the current party political system, but really is to transcend it. And because some of you will know nothing really about what Make Votes Matter is, and what I mean by trying to break or transcend the system, I'm going to start with inviting Klina to explain, as basically as you can, Klina, what is Make Votes Matter?
Thank you, Indra. That's a lovely introduction. Thanks for having me, and yeah, lovely to see you all here. And some of you I know quite well, so you can probably correct me on what I say about myself. So what is Make Votes Matter? Make Votes Matter is the national campaign for proportional representation in the House of Commons. So that simply means that seats should match votes, seats should equal votes. And that is in fact how democracy is done in most democracies, but we have a very strange, archaic system here, which means that we don't get what we voted for in Parliament and in government. I'll stop there. I can go into a little bit more detail in a moment if you want.
Well, it sounds outrageous, and I know that you've said it really in the most simple way possible, but could you just explain a little bit in more, if I go and I vote for the party that I chose, what happens next? What happens? How does the person get chosen? What
Sure.
actually happens? Yeah.
Sure. Can I just check? Is the lighting all right for me? So
Yeah.
I've put a thing over the lamp because it's blinding me. I'm a bit dark. Is that all right? Okay.
I think I can see you well enough. I hope if anybody's got a complaint, I think it'll be fine.
All
Thank you.
right, good. Yeah, so basically we've got a system that is based on geography rather than on proportion of votes. So we vote for individual constituency MPs, and you get one per constituency. And mathematically, it's not possible to get proportional outcomes with that system when you've got more than two parties. And we haven't had a two-party system for a very long time, if ever. And it's certainly been the case that it was more of a two-party system in the past, but it's very much a multi-party system now. And if you think about, just we can simplify, but the basic maths of it is, if you have two candidates in one constituency, one of them would need to get more than 50% of the votes to win. And so that's somewhat democratic, because at least most people are getting represented, but it might be quite a slim majority. But then if you've got three candidates, effectively the votes could be split three ways. So you could have somebody winning on just over 33.3% of the vote. And again, if it's four, it's a quarter, and you kind of split it down and down. And so the more candidates, theoretically, the smaller the share of the vote that person needs to get to win. So you can end up in a situation, and this has happened, where 3/4 of a constituency's voters are voting against, or at least not for, the candidate that wins. And so to me, that's really not democratic, because most people are not getting what they want. And then if you scale that up across the whole country, you get outcomes like we have at the moment, where the government only had 44% of the vote. So most people didn't choose this government. And again, to me, that's just not right. And in fact, it's worse than that. The last time a single governing party had a majority of the vote was 1931. So we're heading on for a century of not having even the majority, even a slim majority, being happy with who's in charge. And you can get wrong winner elections. Like the Tories once got in when Labour got more votes, and it's happened the other way around as well. And of course, the last US election, not this current one, but the last one, Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, but he became president. And they use the same system, first past the post, for the electoral college. So it's basically like constituencies. There's a simplification of it, but it's basically the same system. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit more.
Yeah. So when you describe it that way, it sounds so obvious that this is, a clear injustice. It's not democracy. So why do we persist with it? What's the argument in its favor? Why do, the Tory party or the Labour Party, or any third or fourth party, why don't they simply get rid of it?
Well, the third and fourth parties do want to get rid of it, for sure, but they don't get into power. So kind of key function of first past the post is that it gives an advantage to the two biggest parties. And in fact, it's worse than that. It gives the biggest advantage to one party. And so in the UK, that's the Conservatives. And I do have to emphasise Make Votes Matter is a fully cross-party campaign. It's not about being anti-Tory, because people who vote Conservative should have Conservative representation. But when it's disproportionate, then everything gets out of whack. Yeah, I've slightly lost my thread. You can bring me back to it if you like.
No, that's fine. So give our listeners some sort of idea of the journey you've been on, because it's been quite a time, hasn't it, that you've been pursuing this. What would you say has changed over the last 10 years of this long campaign? Have you seen any lights in the tunnel? Have you seen any sort of shifting understanding or acceptance of what you're doing? And what do you feel are still the main obstacles?
So, I mean, I've only been doing this since 2015. And my path to this was from concern about the environment and the climate. And so I first became an environmental activist when I was 7 years old, and organised a sponsored silence for Friends of the Earth. and going on from there, I went into sustainable enterprise and eventually realized that all the campaigning in the world, we can't do what we need to in terms of the climate and ecological crisis, which is right on us, without changing the system, because the system is stacked against us. So yes, campaigns sometimes have wins, but they tend to be pretty small wins compared to the scale of change that's needed. Sometimes, yeah, like significant things do happen, but I think maybe it's worth saying a little bit about the outcomes of proportional representation at this point. That in countries with proportional representation, according to loads of different political science studies, they have better environmental outcomes. So they were faster to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and they have better environmental protections, and they have more renewable energy use. So there's a whole list of things. There's a page on our website about it, the outcomes for the environment. And so yes, we can kind of make piecemeal changes, and we managed to get a citizens' assembly on the climate as a consequence of Extinction Rebellion's work. And again, I personally think that work really needed to happen, but Make Roads Matter doesn't take positions on anything aside from PR. But sadly, that citizens' assembly wasn't really what people in XR wanted, because it didn't have teeth, and the scope of it wasn't actually set by the participants. So this is a key thing about deliberative democracy, like the terms of reference, it needs to come from the people involved in it, rather than somebody saying, right, you're going to talk about this, and this is the outcome you're looking for, and that might not be the outcome that's needed. Yeah.
So this is a theme that's more familiar to the alternative generally, which is that the relationship between maybe the broader will of the people is likely to be stifled in some way by the political system. I've made a very broad statement there, but that's more or less what you're describing, that if people want to survive, save the planet, there isn't really an obvious channel for that within this current political system. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And I did a piece on that, about Extinction Rebellion is so much more prominent in this country than in proportional democracies. They don't need to get themselves arrested to have their voices heard. So it's quite a remarkable phenomenon that all these normally law-abiding, caring people are saying, I'm willing to put my life on the line, basically, to risk all sorts of consequences, really significant consequences, because nothing's happening, or nowhere near enough is happening, and we're still hurtling towards this complete climate breakdown. So yeah, I think that's really significant. And the other thing that you just said, obviously brings to mind is Brexit. And you were asking about has anything changed in the last few years to, I don't know, change the prospects for this campaign. And I think Brexit is a really big part in that, because people, they could say on both sides of the divide, or more realistically across the whole Brexit spectrum, are really unhappy with how that came about, how it was handled, what's currently happening. And that, amongst all of the other stuff that's going on, how the government's handled COVID, for example, like it's really not handled it well compared to a lot of other countries. And people are seeing that there's a problem with our politics. It's well and truly broken. It's not there for us.
Can we just unpick that a little bit? Because it sounds to me as if what you're saying is that the way we experience our politics seems to be within these binary questions: left versus right, choose this party or that party, choose yes or no, choose leave or remain. That seems to be the mechanism that we are asked to buy into every single time we become a citizen. We have to choose between two things. So in your experience, and going back also to your roots, of why it is that you even wanted to have more political agency, do do you feel that when you say that you think people know that politics is broken, do you feel that clarity around these, impossible binaries is moving to this? Do you think people can see that more clearly than they used to? Or is it just that it's broken and they don't know what to?
I think a lot of people do see that this whole binary system, this kind of antagonistic, combative politics isn't serving us. But I think I would imagine, and this isn't based on me knowing about particular polling, but I imagine there's polling out there around this, that people are dissatisfied with how politics is working without necessarily putting their finger on the fact that it's this kind of binary oppositional thing. But that is really a function of first past the post, because as I said, it gives this false advantage to the biggest party, two biggest parties. So we're used to this idea of us versus them, and the Houses of Parliament being designed at two swords lengths distance. It's about fighting. And in fact, that was why I didn't want to have anything to do with politics for a very long time, because who wants to have anything to do with effectively two groups of blokes fighting? We need to move away from that to understanding that all of the wisdom is valuable, and that it is a spectrum. There are many spectrums, and we need all of the voices to be heard. So more women's voices, more diverse voices, and then we can actually represent what the people in the country want much better if the people representing us have lived experience of that.
So when I hear you talking and I know what's driving you and I know where you're coming from, then I wonder what your experience is when you're trying to convince those who won't join the campaign, or who won't go for proportional representation. What is your experience of that interface? Do you find that it's very difficult to have a really whole spectrum conversation in these political circles, that you yourself are always, how do you experience people's resistance to you? Do you feel that that's more important for them to win than it is to, for example, save the planet, or be able to, bring the country together? Or what's your personal experience of that?
I think the most frustrating bit about that is Labour politicians who come up with spurious reasons why PR isn't something they're going to focus on, like, well, PR isn't a panacea, it's not going to fix everything. It's just like, nothing is going to fix everything, but PR is actually, according to the evidence, probably the most significant thing that could make the biggest change. It's the keystone that enables us to bring in the other democratic changes that we so urgently need to see. So when you're talking to people who are kind of coming up with this kind of stuff, there's a million kind of side steps a politician can do. Say, oh, well, my constituents are more interested in like the issues closer to home, like how the economy is affecting them, or local issues, potholes, whatever.
Yeah.
I think the conversations about in terms of dealing with people who won't engage or who are objecting, you have to kind of pick your battles. I don't really like to use a fighty analogy, but some people are clearly open to a conversation, even people who are really against PR. You can sense that there's an interest, and some of those people are really important in terms of who they're connected to, like which organization they run. And so there have been some kind of key examples of Labour movement leaders who are really not very helpful, but I've pursued and convinced and eventually softened. So part of it's not just about finding those who can really support, it's about softening the opposition from the most vocal opponents. So like one example was John Landsman, who used to run Momentum. He went from very anti-PR to quite open to it. On paper. But some people, it's not going to be worth that amount of effort to convince them because they don't run momentum, for example.
Yes. Yes, that sounds like it would be a great breakthrough. So it sounds like you're also describing the cultural shift that needs to occur, like a different way of being in the space. And from that point of view, do you think that women play a different role, or do they have a different openness to this, or is there no gender aspect? What's your experience?
I don't know that I've particularly noticed that there's a gender difference in more women wanting PR. I think a gender difference that I do notice is that, and again, like generalizations are dangerous, but I think women tend to want to be much more clear, thinking that they know everything about something before they'll start saying, oh yes, I know about that thing and I'm going to state my opinion. And I think because there's this kind of infinite array of possible voting systems, so like nobody's ever going to know all of them, even the world's greatest expert, because there's basically as many voting systems as the human brain can imagine. And so I think certainly my experience when I was starting learning about it, and a lot of other women I've come across, they're a little bit hesitant to say, oh yes, well, PR is definitely better, because they're thinking, oh, but what if somebody challenges me about whether STV or AMS is better and I don't quite understand the counting mechanism? But you really don't need to. I'm a bit brash, and I'll just be like, well, it's just about seats matching votes. You don't need to know the detail.
Yeah, it's quite surprising sometimes when you look carefully that people imagine that we have a democracy that really expresses the spirit of democracy. In other words, our wishes are being reflected in some way in the way that the country is being run. But when we look at the details like this, and when we see that it's very far from the case, it can be quite shocking and confronting to people to think that they've been buying all their lives into something that really gives them very little power.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think when you do share some of the facts with people, they are kind of agog. Like 71% of votes, I think it was, were wasted at the last election. Somebody nod if that's the right number. I'm pretty sure it's 71% this time. Thanks, Laurie. We've had so many elections, you have to remember new numbers each time. But yeah, most votes are wasted. And when people realize that they don't really have a say, yeah, I mean, either you kind of become hopeless or you hopefully start taking action. And I think when you do take action, it's massively empowering. Certainly for me, it was, after many years of an aversion to this, to politics, when I actually went, okay, I need to do something. And when you start doing something, you realize you can make a difference. And I think that's really empowering. And that's what, and as I say, like PR is the keystone to better democracy. We need people to be feeling empowered in their communities, as kind of close to home as possible. They get to decide exactly what's happening around them, and you only go up to the next level of coordinating and organizing where necessary to coordinate with the next village, or up and up until you get to international cooperation. But it has to start local.
Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, you mentioned just before everybody came in the room, actually, that that we were the only country that used to be able to call itself part of Europe that doesn't have proportional representation, except for Belarus.
It's
Is that
the only
correct?
country with
Yes.
first past the post, aside
Yes.
from Belarus. And if you, depending on how you count Europe, you could say Azerbaijan. Belarus is, yeah, very much a dictatorship pretending to be a democracy. And I mean, effectively, I'd say that we are as well. And the government's becoming more and more scary in its kind of anti-democratic and authoritarian ways. And the stuff at the moment, they're trying to scrap the electoral commission, which is the thing that's meant to make sure that people aren't cheating, and saying that it should report to them, which says like you're going to mark your own homework.
So before I open up to the room, and thanks for that, because I think you've conveyed the sort of outrage and the opportunity very well. But can I just invite you to dwell for a second on, imagine that we did, by some miracle in the next election, or even before, through some series of unexpected events, of which we have had many recently, suddenly find ourselves with a proportional system. Can you give me a sort of just an idea of how quickly, or what you think would change directly as a result of that?
So I think New Zealand's a good example to look to for this, because they used to have first past the post, the worst British export ever, and we foisted it onto all of the ex-colonies, and they thankfully managed to get rid of it in the 90s. I think the decision happened in 93 and they switched in 96, and like they're a kind of shining example of democracy done well now, and they've dealt with COVID really well. And the Prime Minister there, Jacinda Ardern, has chosen to have a kind of a coalition in government, even though she didn't need to bring other parties in. She could have just had the Labour Party there, but she's learned that that kind of consensus building collaboration is genuinely valuable for the outcomes of government. And so then you do see, and there are studies about how politics changed there at that point, of like the types of references in speeches in Parliament, and it became so much less combative. And there are particular voting systems where you choose preferences rather than just A or B or whatever, just having one cross in a box, where it incentivizes the parties to be more collaborative and nicer to each other rather than fighting each other. And in terms of the big outcomes, you see all sorts of better outcomes, better social, environmental and economic outcomes. We talked about the environment, we've talked about better representation of women and ethnic minorities, and a massive one for me, which I think a lot of people shy away from talking about because it sounds incredible, is war. That actually first past the post is the greatest institutional predictor a democracy will go to war. So basically our voting system causes war, and I am simplifying there, but it's about starting wars more, staying in wars longer, etc. So there would be significant outcomes if we switch, and I have to always say it's not a panacea. But I do think it's the most important thing we need to change in order to bring in all of the other change.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. So from the alternative point of view, it's the first step towards genuine people's agency, I think, and people feeling that they can firstly participate, but secondly become responsible for the future. If there's no sense that what they do makes a difference, why should they even bother? And I think that's really the state of play, and really more or less the reason why we started the alternative, is to, at least give people the chance to explore how things could be different. But the real breakthrough, I feel, would include, or has to be, changing this political system. So thank you so much, Klina, for the work that you're doing, and support you all the way. So I'd like to open up now to any questions. And the way I would suggest we do that is, given it's not that easy to see you all on one screen, if you could put your name into the chat box. If everybody knows how to get into the chat box, it's just at the bottom of your screen, click on chat. If you'd like to ask a question, would you just put your name in and I'll call upon you. And if I don't see any names, I might just pick on you to ask a question. No, I'm joking. Has anybody got a question?
Could I pick up on a few things I'm seeing about voting systems, if that's all right? Because I realise I've totally failed to mention anything about the Good Systems Agreement.
Yeah, I thought we'd get to that and invite some of your colleagues to draw that out of you. So are we looking at the chat box? But please do explain that. Yeah, so go, Laurie. Yes.
Sorry, I chat box is fine, but I can do that, and you can see that, I suspect.
Yes, I can.
I could contribute quite a lot here, but one of the fundamentals I talk about when I speak to people, and we've been talking about, it's the D word, democracy. It's been talked about here, democratic democracy. And I like to open up with, sometimes, I didn't do this with Stephen last week, but what is democracy? What is it? You know, we talk about, it's a throwaway word. What is democracy? How does it work? You know, what do we mean? You know, we're losing our democracy. You know, we've got to defend our democracy. What does it? You know, okay, you can go back to the Greek demos kratos, power of the people. But hey, ancient Athens was rubbish. You know, it's mostly slaves. Women didn't have the vote. You had to be a male of a certain standing. You had to do your military service, I think. So, you know, we wouldn't recognise democracy in Athens, ancient Athens at all. So what do we actually mean by it? And I've done, I mean, I actually working up to a bit of writing. I've written a couple of bits for West Country Bylines recently, and I'm working up to a bit about democracy and what it actually is. And I really like, I came across some years back a definition, you know, let's pull out what define democracy. A definition by a guy called Ernest Naville, who was a 19th century Swiss theologian and philosopher. And I've just looked it up in my notebook. It's a very, very simple, and if you want to start to look at it, anyway, he said, in a democratic government, the right of decision belongs to the majority, but the right of representation belongs to all. Now then, that certainly doesn't apply to FPTP, first past the post, our present voting system. But you know, you can easily sort of see that that applies to a proportional system, and it's just a nice thing to get people thinking about democracy. What is it? I mean, we just don't have it in this country. I mean, the monarchy is accident of birth. The Lords, well, they're not elected by the people at all. And the House of Commons is extremely badly represented. So democracy, sorry, forget it. In a democratic government, the right of decision belongs to the majority, but the right of representation belongs to all. It's a good starting place for the discussion, I think.
Thanks, Laurie. Did you have a question for Klina that you wanted, or shall we? I think I might like to ask Klina to, and appreciate what you've just contributed there, Laurie, to comment on that. I think you already have to some extent, but whether or not you'd like to explain your good agreement, good systems agreement that we haven't covered yet. Can't hear you, I'm afraid.
Yes, so yeah, I agree with what Laurie's saying, and yeah, there are all sorts of different kinds of democracy, and I don't think we're very close to having real democracy yet in this country, but we're getting there. So in terms of what we're doing to get there, Make Votes Matter has basically 3 strands to the campaign. There's the grassroots, Labour and the Alliance. And so the grassroots is hopefully self-explanatory. It's about getting a broad movement across the country of grassroots demand for better democracy, for proportional representation going. And to that end, we have all sorts of national events. Like one of my favourite ones was 24-hour fast called Hungry for Democracy, which got quite a lot of media coverage. And we do democracy days. So we had a socially distanced one in the summer, with things happening like people dropping a banner, well, many parts of a banner over Westminster Bridge, so each letter of Make Votes Matter. And there were other banner drops like that around the country. All sorts of creative, exciting things that happened. And we've got another one coming up on the 12th of December. So we're going to be encouraging supporters to write Christmas cards to their MPs asking for equal votes. All I want for Christmas is equal votes. So they'll also take selfies and share them on social media. So then there's the Labour bit, which just very recently there's a new Labour for Democracy, a new democracy group that's launched. So we're part of coordinating that, and there's lots of other organisations involved, like the Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform and Compass and the Electoral Reform Society and Open Labour. And the aim with that is to get PR both debated and passed as new policy at next year's conference, which is a massive job and has all sorts of different strands to it. but we're having this massive flurry of new motions being raised for PR from constituency Labour parties. So I think we're at 111, but that might well be totally out of date now because it keeps going up every day. And so we do need one of the two biggest parties to join the alliance, which is the third strand. And we don't think the Tories are going to do that anytime soon. So the focus is on Labour. And the alliance includes all of the British opposition parties aside from Labour, and a whole load of other organisations and public figures. And one of the kind of key milestones with the alliance was producing a good systems agreement last summer. That was kind of a year and a half's work of coordinating the parties to agree on what's effectively a very condensed version of best practice of voting systems from a whole load of different national commissions and consultations, etc., that have happened different places. So it says these are the 10 key principles of good voting systems. So proportionality is obviously key, and there's lots of evidence about the specific link between how proportional the democracy is and the outcomes that we've talked about. And other things like making sure that there is local representation and diversity is a result of the vote. So actually representative of what the people are voting for. And I think a really key bit about that is how it should best be chosen, because it's not for us or politicians or parties to say this is the voting system that everyone should have. And so we think that there should be a genuinely informed deliberative process like a citizens' assembly to choose that. And so this serves two fantastic functions. One is that it's done democratically. It's not the end justifying the means. It's how you get there is just as important. We might not have that possibility of having the Citizens' Assembly, but that's what everyone who's really involved is trying to make happen. And so aside from that, the other advantage is the politicians can say, well, we'll let the people decide that. So if it's quite a difficult issue, like there was a Citizens' Assembly on reproductive rights in Ireland, and for these kind of thorny issues you can basically say, what do the people think, and let them come up with the answer. And yeah, I think that results in better outcomes as long as the people are properly informed, which does mean that referendums aren't a great way to go in the UK at the moment, because the UK isn't set up to do democratic referendums. I personally actually think referendums can be great, but you have to have the systems in place to stop excess influence of money and all sorts of other things, so that it's genuinely the informed decision of the people.
Oh, great, thank you very much.
Whole systems debate.
It's a whole systems debate. Is there anybody else who'd like to ask Klina a question before we go into the breakout rooms? Yes, Stephen, please.
Hi, Klina. One thing that I've thought that's come over with Labour Party members is the great success in New Zealand and how it's fundamentally changed the system in New Zealand, and that it's also shown that you can actually get a majority government with proportional representation. And so my Labour friends, are really sort of catching on to it. And I just wonder, the way that the CLPs have been passing these motions, since Jacinda Ardern has been successful for a second time, have we seen more CLPs passing these motions? Is it part of the oil that's lubricating the debate?
So I think, yeah, what's happening in New Zealand does create opportunities in terms of trying to convince the Labour Party here, because I think a lot of people here think, oh, that's great, Labour Party there is doing really well. Yeah, the same people who are saying that are often some of the people being resistant to the change to proportional representation. So we need to get that message through clearly. We were talking, I think yesterday or very recently, about maybe we could set up a meeting between Keir Starmer and Helen Clark, who was the ex Prime Minister in New Zealand. She spoke at an event that we organised at the Labour Party conference, and so maybe she could have a word with him and encourage him to see the value of changing the voting system.
Great. So if there aren't any further questions, I'd like us to go out to breakout rooms, and I want to pick up on in the break. I'd like you to pick up on, in a way, the connection between what Laurie brought into the room and what Klina was beginning to explore early on, about what would change if we had proportional representation. So what I'd like you to do when you go into your breakout rooms, after you've introduced yourselves to each other in a friendly fashion, is ask yourself, what do you feel would change if we had proportional representation? And then how would you sell that to somebody who's not at all interested in politics? So I think these two things these two questions are linked to each other. So rather than talk about proportional representation and the campaign for PR as a political issue, try and step outside of that and think, imagine that it wasn't an issue. What would then happen? What could change? And then using that, how would you then sell that? How would you sell proportional representation to people who don't care at all about politics? It's a bit of a circular question, but I think I hope you can get the gist of what I'd like you to think about. And we are 1 through 5, 20. So I'm just going to open the rooms. 6, right. We'll have 20 minutes to have a chat, introduce yourselves, and come back in here, and we'll have some more questions for Klina and to share your views. Very much like to hear your views. See you in 20 minutes. Thank you. Would anybody like to volunteer a little summary of what was described, or what was discussed in their room?
Go for it, Catherine.
Yeah, in our group we kind of we talked about quite a few different things which we imagine could be used as ideas about PR that are not so overtly political, like in the language that you could use to talk about them. The first that we thought of was the shape of the chambers, like say in Scotland and Germany, the more circular style compared to the kind of oppositional head-to-head style of the Westminster Chamber. We talked about whether about kind of positioning the discussion of PR as one about communities rather than just politics, about giving, although that is politics, that it's more like an appeal to communities in general, and how it would be a style of politics that would allow, it would be a style of discussion that would allow kind of people's, the differences between people's stances, the nuances to be kind of drawn out and given space, rather than they being the things that are sort of squashed down and eliminated, and can kind of cause a lot of under the surface divisions, or I mean not always under the surface, but divisions between people who are actually more each other's supporters than enemies. The kind of small divisions can become the things that, the small differences can come between people who could be standing together. And we talked about it as a sort of one step in a bigger direction, one step in a direction, not an end goal, but like part of a move towards a better society. And, you know, different people would bring in different other things that could be done. Like even if you were, you know, whether you're very radical and you really wanted a complete reshaping of our society, this could be a sort of way of getting more people engaged and energized. And so that might take place. Or you might be someone who sees many different smaller things that need to happen. And again, this is just like one part of many different things that can get changed. Yeah.
That's great, Catherine, because it sounds like you covered such a lot of ground, like a kind of cultural shift, you know, as well as drawing it into that place where we start talking about community and participatory politics, very much what we talk about here at the Alternative UK. And I wonder if you've had a chance, or any of you who are directly involved with Make Votes Matter have had a chance to think about the kind of participatory politics, for example, that the independence campaigns like flat pack democracy, all those sorts of things, that they are trying to usher that in. I think the more that we make connections between a new kind of politics and what Make Votes Matter is trying to deliver, the stronger we can get, you know, ordinary people behind your cause. So that's great. Thanks very much. Anybody else like to share? Laurie, did you say not you?
We'll go to Roger first. I mean, you've heard my voice quite a bit.
Yeah,
Roger.
I was with Arnie and Klina. So the main thing that we talked about was twofold. One was not just your average person who's not engaged in politics, but people who are involved in the parties. We saw some people involved in parties are very pro our cause and very helpful. Some are not, and there are some significant barriers that we need to break down in terms of tribalism, of helping them understand that cooperation sometimes is better than competing. On the topic of someone that's not engaged with politics, the thought was to find a topic that they are interested in, like a local hospital closing or something like that. So I ask them first and listen, something that means something to them, and then relate that back in terms of who's representing them in Parliament or local councils. Bring it back to wasted votes. So is their person, the way they voted, is the person in or not? Often it won't be. And point out the wasted votes and the number of wasted votes across the whole country that Klina was talking about earlier, and bring it back that way was the way we. So I don't know if Arnie or Klina have anything to add to that. That was the main thinking.
Yeah, I think it's very helpful. Thank you. Klina, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I think my main thing about somebody who's not interested in politics is go to where they are, find out what they care about, what is a problem for them that they want to improve. So the example I gave in our conversation was about a local hospital being shut down, and then you can say, well, actually, if we had real democracy, we could do something about that, because your MP would be representing you, and there's evidence that proportional democracies look after the health of the population better, etc. So I think that there's always a way to explain it which means something to the person if it's about stuff they care about.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I'm also interested how, when I think, Catherine, when you were beginning to talk about just the shape of the you know, the parliamentary chamber, you know, what is the effect on people when they see that, you know, on television day in, day out, the sort of oppositional benches? you know, and then maybe when they see something like the Scottish Parliament, you know, and they see the round chambers and they see that in other places, you know, whether or not that actually has quite a visceral effect on people and think, you know, what is the culture here? What is the tone of our politics? You know, is that partly the reason I'm not in the least bit involved? I just don't like it. So many people that I meet just don't like politics. It's such a simple, you know, first level, gut level response. I don't like it, you know. And Ros, why not tell us what you discussed.
You know, I was just going to jump in there after the work that I did for the UK Parliament around education and engagement, and the 4 years that I did workshops with teenagers, with community groups, and this didn't really come up very much in primary because they hadn't really seen debates in the chamber, but the confrontational nature of it was a very big issue for a lot of people that we spoke to. So I just wanted to kind of back that up with what you were talking about. Yeah, it's something that it doesn't kind of bring a pride about how decisions get made within the Parliament. Yeah.
I think it makes people afraid actually to participate or to imagine that they could participate, and even quite thankful that they only have to give a vote every 5 years, and that's the end of it. You know, but when then you connect that to what Klina was talking about at the beginning about how do we save our planet, there's really nowhere to go, is there, with that feeling of I want to do something. And that's why, exactly as Klina was describing, things like Extinction Rebellion become absolutely necessary. There's nowhere else to express these feelings of we need to do something. Very much, you know, what we're exploring all the time. And for those of you who are not familiar with The Alternative, I recommend we write a daily blog, and there are so many good projects that are there to express, you know, the people's frustration or people's desires, how they want to see a better world. There's so much of that, but it doesn't really touch on politics, hardly at all, the party politics that we imagine as representative for our democracy. Peter, I know you had your hand up earlier on, and you know that you had a good discussion. Do you want to give us a sense of what was discussed in your room?
Okay, I was just Googling to see what rates of political literacy are like in New Zealand, to see if there was an alignment between proportional representation and better political literacy in schools. Does anyone know if there's a link there?
Who would be measuring political literacy, I wonder?
Right.
Yeah.
So that's, well, I was going to have a look on Google and see if that, but then you called me out, so I'd have to stop that. Right. So if I could summarize, I mean, we kind of looked at some of the I guess we were talking about some of the flaws of first past the post local politics, and I tried to sum this up. I maybe haven't done this very well, but you know, PR means that you don't need to tactically vote anymore, so you can vote for exactly who you want. And if you were to sell that to people that maybe don't care about politics, then maybe you would sell that by saying, you know, you get to be honest with yourself now. You know, you don't have to lie to yourself or, you know, vote through gritted teeth. You can actually just vote for whoever you like. I think it's a really interesting and important way to frame this, because we could fling shit at first past the post all day, but actually saying, okay, well, what would be better, and then how would you sell it? I think that is the way around we ought to do this, and actually kind of thinking about the positive messaging, and something that we've spoken about quite a bit as well. I think this sort of less combative, more collaborative politics that is showing up in New Zealand and has done for over the past 24 years, I think, since that study started, was it 1996? So for the past 24 years, they've been able to measure a more collaborative politics, less combative. And I suppose if you're under 30 and your experience of democracy is watching Question Time, and you know, your dad's or mum's experience of democracy is largely like, well, this is the least worst sort of solution, and this is just the way it works, so, you know, kind of have to get along with it. If you're under 30, you're probably looking at this sort of disgusted. Not even under 30, I'm over 30 and I'm disgusted at watching Question Time. which is why I wanted, when I initially pitched my event series to 38 Degrees, it was, can we have a question time that doesn't have any career politicians on stage, so that we can look at what that conversation how that conversation would evolve without them involved in it. I'm waffling now. But this less combative, more collaborative politics things, is that then likely to attract more talent? Possibly, probably, certainly a greater diversity of views, which could, in theory, equal less chance of bullshit. And I think that's what, if you're going to sell a positive thing, it's like, well, maybe there's going to be less chance of bullshit, maybe more honesty.
He said as Klina brought a baby elephant into the room.
Right, stepping back now.
Thank you, Pete. Klina, I'm going to invite you to introduce your elephant and explain what your elephant is doing in the room. Before I ask you a final question, but go on. Explain your elephant.
Well, my elephant's seen another elephant, and so it wants to say hello. What's that, elephant?
Yeah.
Ah, what nice tusks you have. So this is Eve, the Equal Votes elephant, and so Pamela and I are part of a group that's trying to bring a lot more fun and creativity and silliness, and maybe even a bit more challenging activity to campaigning for equal votes. And we hit upon this idea of the motif of the elephant in the room. So the voting system is like this gigantic issue that people aren't talking about enough. And so you can visualize a giant elephant in the House of Commons, and people are trying to have their shouty, fighty arguments around the edge of the elephant, like leaning around it, but just ignoring the fact that the elephant's there, and the elephant sat on their pile of papers, and they're trying to pull them out. They're still trying to ignore that the elephant is there. And so there's some quite fun stuff that we're working on. We had a very sudden launch. The woman who actually designed this suffragette diary, which I've been filling in every day of this year. So Kat, who is a designer, came up with a brilliant design of the elephant in the boom on bonfire night. And we've got some other creative projects in the work, but it's just trying to make it a little bit more fun and creative. So yeah, get an elephant.
I've got 3 elephants in my room actually, but I won't talk about it now. I can't actually put my hands on them. But and a question I've been meaning or burning to ask actually, and I'm amazed actually that it hasn't come up already, which is that I imagine one of the first things that would happen if we had proportional representation is you'd suddenly have a whole load of new parties. For example, the alternative would never be a party under the current system, but it would seriously have to consider it if we had proportional representation, because at least there'd be a chance of being represented or heard. Right now, you'd have the fate of the Green Party in front of you, which is to spend years and years in the wilderness with only 1 MP in the actual parliament. So is that a prospect that you would relish? And I would put that question to everyone, to suddenly have, and just to give you a clue, since Brexit, we've had 90 new parties register themselves in the UK. It's a hell of a number, and that's even without proportional representation.
But this is a really interesting thing about PR. People assume that it leads to a splintering and more parties, and it's really not the case that will necessarily happen. So actually in the UK, we're really remarkable for the vast number of parties we have registered. It's just that most of them aren't represented at all, and I think that's a function of people feeling disenfranchised. And if you look to New Zealand, a lot of people say, oh, well, the Labour Party will split if we have PR. That's not what happened in New Zealand. The Labour Party stayed together. Who knows what would happen here? It may split in 2 or more. but I don't think it's a necessary conclusion. And yeah, so the evidence doesn't show that that would be the case.
But is it not? Would it not be quite something to? It might be something to enjoy.
Yeah, well, certainly having more diverse representation would be good.
Yes. So did anybody? Yes, Stephen.
Oh, sorry, was someone else going to speak then?
It was Richard. I was going to say something.
Sorry, Richard, I didn't see your hand up at all.
I mean, oh, sorry, I didn't put. Anyway, if I have the thought, I'll be quick. It was just to say, in our sort of discussion group, we were talking about one way of reaching out to people is to that they feel they know and can relate to the person they voted for. And obviously it's an argument that some of our MPs use, you know, they build up a personal vote over the 30s or whatever it is they intend to have as a full career in the House of Commons. And it is real, you know, they basically met most of the people who vote for them over, you know, a period of 20 odd years or something. And that's how they stay incumbent, you know. But if you don't vote for them, I always feel like if you had about five representatives, you'd be able to relate more closely to the one, you know, the one that you voted for, or you'd be able to you'd have more chance of everybody finding a relationship with somebody who's their elected representative. And that's not just about Westminster, that's about local authorities and, you know, right down to the sort of hyper local level, parish councils and town councils and stuff, where, you know, there's a real chance that everybody can know who they voted for. And I think that to me, Maria is in our group saying, you know, the Danish system's not the perfect magic solution to everything. There's still a lot of problems that I think this is partly related to electoral systems that are about voting for putting a cross next to the name of a party, and then you get given who you were given off a list, is very different from the Irish Republic system of you're voting for people that you know who are appealing to you as on the basis of their personality and who they are, who also have a party label. And I think that, you know, to me, that's a better system and will probably be more appealing to people who are a bit disengaged from politics. I don't think a bun fight of 500 different parties would go down very well with the average British person. It would settle down, obviously, and so, you know, it would be kind of fun. I mean, I'd love it, but and it would settle down because you know, at the end of the day, you can't have everybody standing as an independent because you don't know who the politics are. So they need to give themselves a label. So anyway, that's my contribution, right, and that's kind of what we discussed. Yep. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks very much, Richard. I can see that we've come to 6:30 now, so I think that look on the face is, Klina, have you spotted another elephant? Yes.
Yeah.
I can see the tone. The tone is definitely changing. Well. This is
frogs
a very
and
new
dragons. Where are the frogs and dragons? And penguins and owls and bears.
This is a good one for the environment, I must say. All right.
Well,
thank you very much. Unless anybody's got a
get PR, we will.
Yeah, I've got a reindeer as well, but that's over there.
All right. Okay. I think it's time to. I'm going to just close this down now, really fast. All right. So thanks very much, Klina. That was a great session. I learned a lot, and I think we had some very good ideas coming from everyone. And good luck with the year ahead. I think things are changing in all sorts of unexpected ways. So who knows? This may, you know, we may make some extraordinary breakthroughs sooner than we expect. But in the meantime, thanks very much.